la suite, évidemment, on est en direct, 9h58 de
Once
cette
again,
6e édition des
we're
Matinales de la
coming to you live
distribution.
from
On va
this
faire un
sixth
rapide, pas trop rapide non plus, tour d'horizon, des
Breakfast Club.
chiffres clés notamment, intéressants
We're
en
going to
matière
look
de
at some
frais.
key
Bonjour,
figures with
Christophe.
regard to costs. Hello,
Oui, bonjour
Christophe.
David. Et il n'y aura pas que les frais.
Oui, mais je dis,
Morningstar,
directeur général de Morningstar pour la France. On vient de voir que l'industrie de la gestion
Executive Director
d'actifs
for France. We've
avait un
seen
rôle,
that
un rôle central dans ce
asset
cadre
management has a
pour la
central
transmission de ce
role
plan de relance.
in
Si on
this
fait d'abord
recovery
un rapide
project.
état des lieux du marché des fonds, c'est quoi les premiers chiffres clés à
What are
avoir?
the first key figures that we should keep in mind
Les
when we're
tendances,
thinking about
et
the
peut-être
funds
justement
market?
pour pouvoir
I think the trend,
lancer ces tendances, je vais reprendre le titre du rapport du Sénat qui est
I'd like
sorti le mois
to
dernier,
go back
qui est
to
donc le
the
rapport sur la
CMA
protection des
report
épargnants, qui est
from last month,
payer moins et
which
gagner
is
plus. Donc,
pay
en
less,
gros,
earn
avoir
more.
des frais moins élevés
So their
et
costs should be
investir
lower,
dans autre chose que du fonds en euros.
and
et des
people should be able to invest
Donc
in
ça, un peu,
other
ce
things
sont les
than
tendances,
savings
ce
accounts
sont les chiffres
and euro
dynamiques
funds. These are
dont on va parler.
figures
C'est
that we'll
d'abord
be talking
une
about, of
baisse
course.
des frais
It's,
courants
first of
sur
all,
l'ensemble des OPCVM. Donc là, je ne parle pas
a
uniquement des
decrease
fonds relance, hein, bien sûr, on est sur un univers qui est
in
large.
costs and operating costs.
Donc, une baisse qui existe depuis très
And
longtemps.
this decrease has been
Si je prends
underway
des
for some
chiffres,
time.
En 2000 aux États-Unis,
In
on était à peu
2000
près à
in the US,
0,90,
we're
un peu moins
at
d'un pourcent. Voilà.
zero
Les chiffres sont là, donc
90
0,93 en 2000 et 0,41 en 2020. Donc là, on est sur des chiffres
0.41 in 2020
US,
for the
en
US.
Europe, et c'est le graphique que vous avez
And
ici.
in Europe,
On est
you
à
can see this
1%
chart
en
here. We're at
2013
1% in
et
2013 and
9% en 2020.
0.69% in 2020.
Pondéré par les
These are
entreprises.
weighted figures.
Du coup, c'est quelque chose d'assez différent de la moyenne arithmétique. Si on
You
prend
can
la moyenne
see that
arithmétique,
if you
la
take
baisse elle est
the-
moins importante. Ici, on a moins 31%
If you take
de
the
baisse
average,
qui est
we're looking
pondérée par
at
les encours.
minus
Au
31.
contraire,
If it's
si
weighted
jamais on prend
by
une moyenne arithmétique, on a une baisse d'à peu près
the
20%,
assets.
19% exactement, sur la période
And that
2013
leads to
2020, des frais
a decrease
courants
of
sur les
19%
fonds,
since
les fonds en
2013 or
Europe. Donc quand
31%
même
weighted.
quelque chose de très important.
So
Mais là, on parle des frais courants. Donc, par
We're
rapport au
looking
rapport
at
du Sénat qui parle de l'ensemble des frais,
regular
nous, on
costs
ne prend pas en compte les frais de distribution, les frais
and
de
not
contrat pour l'assurance
distribution
vie, ainsi de suite. Et donc,
costs
c'est
or
peut-être là
contract
aussi
costs
qu'il
on
faudrait
life
un
insurance
peu
policies, for
étudier.
example. So that's a
Il y a une
bit
tendance de fond.
different.
On voit bien qu'il y a
Tendance
quand même-
de fond.
qui commence
We
à
would have to
s'accélérer
study
de
that a
cette baisse
little
des frais.
more
Les
in
raisons.
detail to have
Les raisons, alors elles sont
a more
multiples.
accurate
D'abord,
response. What are the
les
reasons for this
frais,
decrease? Well,
les fonds les plus gros,
The
par exemple,
biggest
les fonds qui ont les
funds,
frais les moins élevés attirent
the
le plus.
funds
Donc,
with
cette
the
moyenne
lowest
pondérée,
costs attract the
va,
most
faire
investors,
baisser
and that's why
le niveau
this
des frais.
weighted
Aussi quelque chose de contre-intuitif, c'est que les
figure
fonds ESG
is on the decrease, and
ont des frais qui
ESG
sont moins
funds
élevés que les fonds
have
non ESG.
less
Ça, c'est un peu
have
une
lower
surprise parce
costs
que
than
on
non-ESG
pensait
funds.
que le
And this might
de
be
la partie
surprising
ESG allait justement rajouter
because you might have
partie
thought
des
that
frais. En
that
fait,
would
c'est pas
add
ce que l'on voit.
costs.
Ici, on voit que les fonds
But in fact, it's the
ESG
opposite. The
sont à
ESG funds are at 0.57%.
On parle gestion active ou gestion passive là?
You're talking
Là, on
about
parle sur
active
l'ensemble.
or passive
Mais vous avez
management.
en
This is
dessous,
overall management.
si je regarde bien, oui, non, pardon, c'est pondéré par les encours ou
So this is
simplement non pondéré par les
weighted
encours.
by
Donc là, c'est
assets
sur
or
l'ensemble,
non-weighted.
David. Et donc, du coup, les fonds ESG sont moins chers, mais simplement la gestion,
So,
et là vous avez raison, la gestion passive, les
Passive
fonds ESG
management
sont plus chers.
of ESG
En termes de frais.
funds
C'est
is
contre-intuitif.
more expensive. So it's a bit
C'est
counterintuitive.
la moyenne parce que
But this
ce sont
brings
les
the
nouveaux
average
fonds
down because
ESG,
these new ESG funds
qui sont le plus lancés et donc du coup qui vont faire baisser l'ensemble
have
de la moyenne.
brought
Puisque,
the
bien sûr,
overall
c'est la
average
tendance,
down.
on en a parlé l'année dernière au
And
matinal.
that's, we talked about this last year at the breakfast
Les
meeting.
ETF
And
ESG
this
sont
brings
plus
down
chargés.
the average for
Les ETF
ESG.
en gestion active, c'est le contraire. C'est intéressant quand même. Justement, sur la gestion passive, on est
So
où?
with regard to
Alors,
passive
là aussi, c'est un développement
management,
qui est très important et qui est, je dirais, la
Where are-
principale raison
well,
aussi de la
the
baisse des
main
frais. C'est la
reason
concurrence
for
de la
the
gestion
lower
passive, la
cost is
gestion
because there's
passive.
competition from
Aujourd'hui, en
passive
Europe, c'est à peu
management.
près
Today,
0,20%, hein,
passive
en
management is
frais
at
courants. Donc, on montre
0.20%
vraiment
in
une
operating
différence avec
costs. You can see
l'ensemble
there's a
de
difference
l'ensemble des
between
fonds. Et aujourd'hui, la
the
gestion
funds
passive, ça
overall and
représente en Europe
passive
21%
management today
des
is
encours.
21% of all
On est loin
assets.
des États-unis. Les États-Unis, c'est
Far from the US,
44%,
that's
et
where
les
it's
États-Unis,
44%.
on a
In the US,
toujours explosion
we have had an explosion
de la gestion passive.
of passive management.
Collecté sur un an fin septembre aux États-Unis.
At the end of
100
September, $800 billion in passive management, with regard to $200 billion in active management.
La gestion passive active représente encore une partie importante des encours. Donc en pourcentage, la
So
gestion
in
passive
percentage,
en Europe
passive
aussi,
management
c'est la même
is
chose. Et là,
increasing
peut-être un petit
steeply.
point sur la crise du Covid
And perhaps
et
a
de voir son
little
impact sur les
word
encours.
on
Ici,
the
vous voyez sur ce
impact of
graphique, bien
COVID
sûr,
on assets. You can see,
l'importance de la
or on
décollecte
inflows, you can see that the importance of outflows
en mars
in March
2020,
2020.
mal à me relire. Donc en mars 2020, bien
In March
sûr,
2020,
avec l'arrivée de la crise de la Covid.
Of course, we had the COVID crisis was beginning, and we had massive outflows, in particular with regard to passive management, 10 times more outflows from passive management than from active management, whereas the ratio is 1 to 4.
a beaucoup souffert
So,
en mars 2020.
Active management suffered a lot in 2020.
Alors,
Any other important figures you'd like
une
to
nouvelle tendance, et
present?
là ça va peut-être
A
avec
new
le
trend,
dernier
and this perhaps goes with the
du
idea
rapport du
of
Sénat, c'est
earn more,
l'importance que
pay less, is
prennent, les catégories plus risquées,
the importance of the higher risk
ici, on voit les
categories.
catégories actions.
In particular, here you see
Toujours
shares.
Mars 2020, une décollecte
March
qui est
2020, you have
extrêmement
an
importante,
significant
moins 60
outflow,
milliards, moins
minus
59 exactement.
60 billion,
et
59 billion
Je
exactly,
dirais vraiment un choc par rapport à la
this was
tendance. Donc là, on a une
quite a
tendance
shock
long terme sur
with
une
regard to the
dizaine d'années.
long-term
Et
trend
pourquoi j'ai
over
choisi
10
de mettre en
years.
valeur
And
ces 10 ans ou de mettre de
I wanted
montrer
to
ces
look
10 ans,
at
c'est
these
parce
10
que,
years because
au contraire, fin 2020,
I think we can see at the end of 2020, November, December, and the beginning of 2021, we had a record level
sur les catégories actions, donc une
of
collecte
inflows.
de 63 milliards, 61 milliards et quasiment
61
milliards sur
billion
ces 3 mois. Donc il faut
over the 3 months.
mettre en rapport. Et
So
vraiment
it's
une
important
collecte
to keep this in mind that we have had a record amounts of inflows
plus risquées,
on higher risk products. So perhaps people are looking for greater performance with regard to assets that have
Sur les
less
fonds ESG, Christophe,
return.
on a parlé de leurs frais moins élevés.
What about ESG funds? You have already noted that they are less expensive, especially for actively managed funds, and they are developing very quickly, exponentially even. And it was never really just trendy. I think that now investors are really convinced of the interest of ESG funds. That's something that comes up in every round table. And since 2020, we now have an indicator that makes it possible to follow up on this trend, thanks to the SFDR regulation. With a number of with a classification in Article 9, 8, 7, etc. funds. In Article 8 funds, they have one ESG target. In Article 6, you have other funds, and Article 8 and Article 9 funds are massively used. Now they make up more than 35% of stocks, so that's a huge increase. And about half of the funds that have been launched over the past half year are ESG funds. So you can see that it's a real trend. And I wanted to show you a few examples here on the slide, just to give you the distribution by region. We already discussed the difference between the US and Europe when it comes to active or passive management. In Europe, we are ahead of the curve on the ESG segment, with 180 such funds that were launched in 2020, and in France, 25 climate funds have been launched since the beginning of the year. All right, so a lot of Article 8 and 9 funds. Is that too much? I would say not for the planet, and maybe not for the investor either. That's really a question of having more choice for them. the regulation had been implemented to make sure that management companies would have different levels of reporting. And at the beginning, it was a bit chaotic. There were some funds that should have been Article 6, but depending on their positioning and the positioning of their competitors, they decided that they would actually list under Article 8, because it is quite easy to just say that you have one social objective or one environmental objective in your fund. It's easy enough to demonstrate that. So there has been this shift, but there will be more reporting in the near future, and we will be able to see whether the segmentation really fits the different funds. I think that those articles, they have been used in a way that is not exactly what was intended to get the label. What is necessary to make sure that we have more inflows? Do we have data on that? Yes, of course, we have this kind of information at Morningstar, and we have a research team that has been looking at the different factors that explain the differences in inflows region by region. We can now have predictive figures, so we know what the main factors are that will make it easier to collect funds. The age of the fund is one thing. It's harder for younger funds. Performance, obviously, the category, these kind of things, whether it's an ESG fund or not, passive or active. So we have all those elements, and we know what they are. There's a lot of them. And here you can see the impact of fees and costs to the final client. And here I have taken the 25% less expensive funds, comparing them with the other 75%. So you have the least expensive funds, of course, attracting most of the flows. So that's a real difference. It's definitely a choice criterion for clients, because they never know what they are going to earn, but at least they know what they are going to pay. And Morningstar has this advantage that we can account for each factor, and therefore we can predict the inflows. And this predicted flows, then we can compare it to the actual flows. A few words in conclusion. All of that means that management companies can then adapt their portfolio, their offer. They can decide which funds they need to promote and how. So here, for example, you have those in blue, in the blue square, I'm showing funds that should be collecting much more than they are at this point. So this is where you really need to work on your offer and communication. In conclusion, fees are going down, generally speaking. I'm talking about general management fees in all funds. And clients today are looking for better, higher returns, and they are looking at higher risk categories where they can get this return. And this is where distribution has a role to play, because we will need to be there to support them, to help them select their investments. There's also a real appetite for ESG funds. Thank you very much, Christophe Tardy, Morningstar France, for those figures.
Whisper something happy in my ear. Just just a sedative to make me disappear. I am so tired of seeing love